We really could sell an ASMR version of our podcast. I think it would do wonderfully.
What's your rant for today, Jacob? Well, I'm thinking that beer polyeth. The guys are just wasting his time. He's trying to be a plane. It's dangerous for the country.
Oh!
Yeah, there's something like that.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your independent co-op grocer's favorite podcast. It's Speech from the Throne, episode 27.
We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more of cartoon villain Galen Weston demanding gratitude for your own exploitation. We're just here to argue. Hey, Liam, what are we arguing about today?
Well, Jacob, everybody knows right now we're in an inflationary cycle. We're feeling it when we go to the store. We're feeling it when we go to the pumps. I don't mean for this to sound like innuendo, but it really, everybo's feeling it. Like it's something that everybody's going through.
No, every time I get pumped, I feel it for sure, yeah.
Yeah. We're just gonna add just anybody with small children to cover their ears and anyway.
No, it's the last time.
So, point is, everybody's been struggling, and it's not easy for everybody to make ends meet. But you don't tell that to Canada's largest grocers, like they already gave people this slight wage increase for being heroes, only to claw it back, right? Yeah. Don't get mad at them because their profits are 40% greater. Don't get mad at them when they give all their execs bonuses, while their workers make far below what is a living wage wherever they're working. That enough was beginning to anger me, and I think has been angering other people when they've been going to the store and they've been noticing ridiculous jumps in everything. And we can appreciate that there are cost increases in some cases because of supply chain constraints. Everybody recognizes that's a factor. But a lot of corporations, and including Loblaws, hide behind that fact when we can clearly see that their profits year over year have increased since the beginning of the pandemic, when we see that they continue to give their execs bonuses and while their workers, the people actually providing the labor, make nothing. Enough is enough. Enough was enough for me personally before, and I still have to shop there because it's all Canada has. It's like the same three companies in most places. Sometimes there's Walmarts in some places. There's Safeways in some parts of the country. Out here in Atlantic Canada, there are some co-ops out here, Co-op Atlantic. And so there are some alternatives, but not very many. Usually it's Loblaws, Sobeys, who owns IGA, Foodland, who owns many co-ops now. It's Superstore, under Loblaws. It's No Frills under Loblaws, right? Like even the other options are under the big guys. It's very similar to the telecom system we have set up with Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. And if that all enough didn't make you annoyed, well, guess what? Some of you were lucky to have been subscribed to a promo list where you received an email from a certain Galen Weston about how they're freezing prices for their discount brand. And
woo! Yeah!
Some of you were, who didn't read between the lines, were happy that they were freezing prices. But the reality is they're freezing things at inflated prices. And by the way, they're only doing it until January. And by the way, Metro chimed in to say that it's industry practice, even though it's probably not. They probably colluded to do this, but who the heck knows? Yep. We'll never know because they're so secretive and because no one can hold them accountable. But it just goes to show how out of touch these guys are with the public feeling. The Sobeys CEO, or the Empire CEO, I should say, Empire owns Sobeys, was so disgusted with the idea that people be pissed off about the fact that they're profiting off of inflation. Like, how dare you be angry that we're turning a profit? It's like, my dude, sure, capitalism is exploitative for lots of reasons, but there'd be a lot less of people on your back if you did the bare minimum of paying your workers a living wage, paying your workers enough to put food on the table. It's not a difficult thing to do. So when people hear that you are giving your execs bonuses or making record profits in the last 3 years, they're a little disgusted when they see how you treat not only their workers, but them, by charging them ridiculously inflated prices, freezing them, and then acting like you're doing them a favor. It's insulting. It's like, here, what did you say before we started recording? Here, peasant.
Here, peasants, enjoyed your slop. Yeah.
So what I want to talk about is what's to be done about these guys. Do we have to incentivize a new kind of grocery store? Do we Do we get governments to encourage the co-op and maybe provide financial incentives to expand the amount of co-op grocers that there are out there? First off, we should explain what co-ops are, but before that, do we look at government having some involvement in grocery stores? Could there be a SaskTel type solution where, in Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan government actually has a crown corporation that basically sells telecom to compete with the big guys, and it makes telecom prices a lot cheaper there? Could there be a place for the government to do that with a grocery store, whether it's public, private? I don't know what that would look like, but what's the solution here? If it's full nationalization the answer, where it's run like a government department? I don't think it is. Some people think it could be. What do we think? Let's break it down. I want to hear your thoughts on all this.
Well, so when you're talking about government subsidizing food or government delivering food directly to the people, this is not something that is in any way, shape, or form new to a government. Now, that might seem odd for people that grew up in a capitalist system, and it certainly is odd for people that grew up in a capitalist system, but that's kind of because we live in one of the few organizations of people that's willing to let its own population starve and not consider that a problem. All the way back to like the Roman Empire, states were buying in huge amount of subsidized food and sending it to their population to prevent starvation. That used to be a very standard governing practice until we were convinced that the free market could provide food at a cheaper rate. Now, of course, that's definitely more of an agrarian society thing to do because it's more difficult to manage food when you have an agrarian society. You have clear cycles of famine, issues in terms of storing your food surplus for winter, and supposedly a worldwide capitalist system where people are always trading, where when one side of the earth is in winter, the other side of the earth is in summer, in this glorious neocon conservative utopia that we were sold by laissez-faire economics, we would not need government intervention in the food space anymore. Free market was going to maximize as much food as possible, and free trade was going to allow that food to move to where it was most needed at the best times, and everyone would be able to fill their bellies to their finest content. And for a lot of the wealthy world, that is the case. I mean, we have a huge obesity crisis that's unimaginable to our ancestors, but that's really only possible because there's still 5 million people, at least, that starve to death every year. And this year, the UN predicts it could be 10 or 20 million people. It's going to be a terrible catastrophe. And we have people in our own country that are on the brink of starvation as well. It's crazy to think about that in a wealthy Canada, or wealthy country like Canada, but it is absolutely the case.
It's disturbing. This should disturb people, and it doesn't, because there's so many layers of opacity and such a lack of transparency from these companies, not only to step up and do something substantive, but to be hauled in front of a parliamentary committee, for God's sakes. Like, it's just like they're just untouchable, and their lobbying is too powerful, so there's no substantive changes that are made to feed more people, So you're saying there's a role for government in this, and I don't disagree that there could be some role for government in this, but what does that look like? Does it look like a food bank? Does it look like a government subsidized grocery store chain? Does it look like some sort of SaskTel type situation? What does it look like? Or does the government just incentivize some sort of cooperative like exists out in Atlantic Canada, and maybe tries to have it source things locally or ethically as much as possible and lean into that instead of over-reliance on international exploitative supply chains?
Yeah, so it absolutely has to be a government food bank at the very least. So the standard model of welfare checks given to people does not work in a Canadian system where a lot of our food has to be transported from Mexico or from California or from Florida to get to consumers. There isn't, for the vast majority of people, a local source of food that they're actually going to be able to sustain year after year, unless people's diet significantly shrinks. And so what that effectively does is it creates food deserts. There are places in a city Where if you're wealthy, you can walk into your Whole Foods and you can walk into your Farm Boy or whatever. You can walk into the upscale grocers and you can get access to beautiful produce at any time of the year, but for a premium. And if you live in that same city and you don't make a lot of money, if you're surviving on welfare even, there's no place to buy anything at all beyond just, chips and pop, the absolute bare caloric minimum to survive. Because at the price that's offered by the free market, Canada's just too far away from those food-producing regions to ever offer access to as much nutritious food as is required for the average consumer. So the government clearly has a role that it needs to play. Only the Canadian government can possibly afford to compete with large-scale grocers like Loblaws, like Empire, because essentially if you're going to make any sort of effective, cost-competitive grocery chain or food chain in this country, it needs to be a transcontinental operation. No one can do it except for these really, really big companies, and that's why we have an oligopoly. It's why we have oligopolies actually in many, many parts of the country, because Canada is very, very large in terms of geography, but very small in terms of population. And so you need to there's a huge startup cost essentially in building a trans-Canada operation. You need to be able to stretch your supply lines a huge way, all the way from theoretically Vancouver to Toronto or even farther than that. And when you're talking about a supply line that is several thousands of kilometers long, but only connects at maximum 20 to 30 million people, the cost of running that is immense. It's immense. And it's the only one that can possibly compete in that space is the government. But we know when the government tries to provide a service, it's always going to provide it worse than what can be provided by the free market. It's an inevitability. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. When you're talking about a public utility like food, the important thing is that people are fed. It doesn't matter that it's the fanciest food in the world. So I would suggest something like a food bank, like a bargain basement access to the absolutely most necessary foodstuffs, some of the staples that will make sure that no matter what level of destitution people fall, people always have access to a bare minimum of nutrition. And once that's guaranteed, it should also, in theory, lower the price of everything else, because the people that right now are straddling the income limit, the people that are borrowing every paycheck in order to be able to afford to get into the more expensive markets, to get into the Whole Foods, to get into the Farm Boy, if those people have access to cheaper goods, it will relieve pressure. It will relieve that constraint on the fancier food chain, the more luxury level food chain, and it should lower the cost for food for all consumers as well. It's just essentially there's a tier that's missing in Canada because it's so expensive to bring food to the market. There's no incentive to build a lower tier version of shopping. There's just no incentive to do it.
The closest thing is No Frills or Food Basics, both of which are owned by the big guys.
Exactly.
So,
because the best way to make it profitable is to incorporate it with the big guys. Exactly. So because it's an oligopoly, they can still set whatever prices they want. Like they're the ones that are setting the minimum price there, and it's not too much smaller than what you're getting at their regular store. I mean, it's really strange that I just came back from Alberta, and eggs in the Sobeys in Alberta cost exactly the same per dozen as eggs in the Loblaws here in downtown Ottawa.
Wow. Now,
it's so strange. Like we're thousands of kilometers apart, to completely different contexts, and yet you have exactly the same price.
Yeah, that's wild.
And yes, it's clearly, you can just deliberately see that the prices are being set at a central rate of whatever is making this giant operation the most profit. There's clearly areas to be cut, but because no one else has that market power, the prices will not be cut.
Yeah. And that's where the exploitation comes in, and they would look at it as just maximizing. Well, we're just maximizing profit. It doesn't mean that we don't freeze prices for 2 months every now and again. It doesn't mean we don't give a little few cents here, few cents there for a few months every now and again. It's like, shut up, man. Like, seriously, shut up. Like,
Well, it's interesting
such a
though that you
joke.
say that you're angry that these executives are not accountable. I mean, they are accountable to their shareholders. It's
only
exactly
to their
true.
only to their shareholders, and their job is
well,
to
yeah,
maximize profit for them. That's
exactly,
my point.
exactly.
That's
Like
my point.
they're doing exactly as they need to do, and
that's
that's
the
just how
problem.
capitalism works. Like
Therein lies
if you
the problem.
replace the CEO of Empire with a janitor from a Sobeys store, that janitor would act exactly the same way. He would say exactly the same thing. He would know all the experience of being exploited. He would still act the same way.
So you need to change the system.
He'd get the same advice. Yeah, he'd get the same advice. He'd have the same shareholder pressure. He'd have the same board members. There's nothing that the CEO can do in this system. So you have to shake up the system. Now, the co-op model is an interesting model. You can have a consumer co-op where it's the people that shop at the store also own a share of the store in which they're shopping. That's an interesting model. You have worker co-ops where the workers essentially also have votes in like shares in the management of the company. I don't like that model as much, but that is another model that people can build. And so the co-op model works well in Canada because this oligopoly is something that's very difficult to avoid, but the very least, if you have a co-op, then people can profit from their own exploitation. They can buy a share of a company that's going to be milking them. Like, I don't like this because I find it inequitable, but it's certainly more equitable than just constantly getting squeezed for every cent by private oligopolies, which is the absolute worst case scenario.
I definitely agree that co-ops are not the most equitable for the poorest, on the margins of society.
Yes.
The benefit of smaller consumer food co-ops, like the ones here in Nova Scotia, is that you can actually run on the board. Like, so not only are you a member, but as a member you can run for the board of directors. You can vote for the board of directors. There's all kinds of things you can actually do to get involved at your co-op, and different roles you can take on. That's the idea, is that it's almost like a mini org in itself. And the way that it gets run is determined entirely by the people that shop there. That's the idea. Now, there's also a consumer worker hybrid where the board or power structure is made up of a hybrid of the two. Sometimes that can lead to conflict. That's something you pointed out in our private discussion beforehand, and something to certainly be aware of, because so you thought the solution, at least if we're going to try to have more co-ops in Canada, which I still think, I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think it's a part of the solution. And if government's going to incentivize that, then maybe they should incentivize a consumer co-op with a unionized workforce to have the advocacy come from outside, the worker advocacy come from outside the organization as a counterweight. And I think that makes some logical sense. I'm still not quite decided as to which is better, but I think that could make sense. The last, just to finish what I was wrapping up saying, is that so if you're gonna go if you're gonna incentivize co-ops, I think maybe that's what you should go for. Or you could go for just a consumer co-op like we already have. But then the issue is still, okay, but how do you make pricing more equitable for the very poor? And a government food bank could work, but it also just sounds very sad. It feels like, can't we do better than a government food bank in terms of the quality we offer, in terms of how we serve and treat people?
Well, no. I mean, this government in theory can, but not the government that we have inherited. But I'll start from the beginning by saying that a worker consumer co-op is an interesting idea, and there are lots of companies, I'm thinking particularly in Germany, where workers are represented along with shareholders. That according to the laws of Germany, companies of a certain size have to have elected worker representation on their corporate boards. Now, this works really well in a manufacturing setting, when Germany already is famous for manufacturing high-end products. And so it sort of makes sense to have worker representation there, because at the end of the day, you're just making their life better by having them on the board. And it doesn't make any difference whether Germany produces a million high-end cars or they produce 1.1 million high-end cars. At the end of the day, no one's starving because of that. When you're talking about the food supply of your country, however, I think the resource is so necessary that Labour has to take at least a bit of a back seat in prioritizing their concerns. that it's much more important to me that everyone gets fed than that every grocer is happy with their work. Now, I understand, though, that there is push and pull in this dynamic, and I think that management can really only do one thing at a time. And I want management's goal as the grocer not to make profit, as Sobeys is doing right now, or Loblaws is doing right now. I want the management's goal should be to maximize the amount of food, good, nutritious food, that Canadians have access to. And if the goal is that, it will sometimes conflict with labor. Because the best way to do that, to lower the cost of food, to make it more equitable, is you want to reduce costs. And labor is a cost. But if you have your workers in a union, if they can fight back against management, you can find a nice middle point between these two interests. But if management has to get the direction from its own workforce, it'll be asked to do two things simultaneously. Asked to maximize food, or food access to Canadians, or to increase the salaries or better the workplace conditions of its workers. And it'll have to compromise on one of those two things. And if there's true representation by the workers, it will certainly prioritize what management wants. It's much better for a corporation to have one goal in particular and has to compromise in order to reach that goal than to try and balance two goals simultaneously. It always leads to some sort of conflict or a breaking of ignoring one of those goals.
I think
organizations need to move in one direction.
The reason that I am still not completely sold by your argument.
Okay.
I think you underestimate, at least in very large corporations, the large disparity in salary between labor and management, particularly high management, like at the executive level. And I think it's good to have, I don't think workers ever expect to make as much as management. Like, there has to be some sort of hierarchical structure, I guess, but workers expect to make enough to bring the bread home, I think, and it'd be well taken care of. And benefits, if they can get it. Like, benefits are something that everybody really should have in an ideal world. Like, just so you know, you're covered, you're taken care of, and you don't have to worry about those things and being charged for those things, and those extra costs. But the reality is, a lot of the workers in today's, I know you're not advocating for the big grocers, by the way, but I'm just using it as an example of the structure. Like in Loblaw, they make nothing. They make under a living wage, whereas their execs will make millions a year sometimes. So I mean, like, yes, a union could advocate well for the workers. Yes, I think there are also benefits to having workers involved in a co-op, to be honest, in some sort of a hybrid. And I'm not, you're right that there could be, it could be a potential for failure if that balance isn't achieved. But to say it's not doable, I don't think is entirely accurate, because those large companies do exist that are worker consumer co-ops. And if it's a large enough company where they have supermarkets and things, there's always going to be, I think, a bit of a disparity between execs and between labor force, but at least the labor force there can count on, I mean, I don't know how much they make. Maybe they also make nothing, but the idea is in principle that whether with a union or with a worker consumer co-op, that workers make at least enough to bring bread home, and to kind of, take care of themselves kind of somewhat. I think a union is more obvious to us because that's the traditional sort of tool. Like, whereas co-ops are a little bit more. They exist in Canada. There are a lot of co-ops in Canada, but our large infrastructure is all large private companies or multinationals or just like oligarchs like the Westons. But I don't know. I'm not completely swayed by your argument that it's not workable. But I appreciate what you're saying about the risk of that balance not getting right. Though there are also frequent clashes between unions and management, right? Like, there are always going to be clashes. It's just like, where do the clashes take place? And
well, yes,
there's.
I'm definitely more of the model where I prefer conflicts to be out in the open rather than internalized in the organization. I think that if two people have diametrically opposed views, then they should set up diametrically opposed organizations rather than try to exist in the same organization, because I'm interested a government-run service. When I look at the model for these sorts of state-run entities, whether it's in the Soviet Union or in China. They do technically call themselves worker cooperatives, and you look at their structure, and theoretically you see that there is worker representation. If you literally read the org chart of these organizations, there is literally worker representation, there's shareholder representation, there's state representation. The shareholders usually are also an arm of the state, but they're sometimes separate entities, particularly in China. But fundamentally, how these systems actually work is all of these people end up saying the same thing, because one of those parties takes over and dominates the other ones, because there's only one organization, and in order for the organization to survive, it can't be going in 3 different directions. So even though they do claim to represent 2 or 3 different interests, they always choose one of those interests to dominate. And that's the common complaint about the Soviet Union and about China before it liberalized its market, was that the interest that dominated was not the interest of the workers, but the interest of the state. That it claimed to have all these enterprises where workers were calling the shots, and in practice they definitely did work more democratically than a lot of American or European firms. But at the end of the day, it was the party people, the people in the Communist Party, that were actually dominating what happened there. And if you ever tried to make your own actual union that represented your own workers' interests, you were shot or jailed. Like, it was very clear that there was one party line that was dominating, and even though they had built these structures that were meant to represent workers, what they really were was just a legitimizing exercise for the party's mouthpiece. It had nothing to do with actual listening to workers. And the same thing would likely happen here. I don't think that we'd have gulags and one party state, but someone's interest has to dominate eventually in these sorts of arrangements. And so I much prefer a union model where the union can be the best union it can be, and the grocery can be the best grocery it can be, and those two will fight each other, and in the outcome of the fight, you have the best possible outcome. Versus the union being built into the grocery store, and either the grocery store just becomes a union vehicle and it hires as many people as possible and pays them as much as possible and ends up giving no food, or the grocery takes over and it becomes the most efficient food producing vehicle possible, but all the workers hate their jobs and want to hang themselves, which can be the 2 possible options in my opinion. And neither of those are good. I prefer to see a balance between the 2.
So I take your point. I take your point there. Still don't know if I fully agree, but I appreciate the full.
Okay.
I still appreciate the full analogy, and certainly like the risks of like guys just lining their own pockets or whatever. Like if it's not the big execs like right now lining their pockets, then maybe it's the guys inside of the board of directors of a massive co-op lining their pockets. But it's like the reality is like the only place where someone's not intentionally and just needlessly lining their pockets is no place. Like, someone's always going to find, there's always going to be people to come in and line their pockets. I'd like to think that if you're, I think it's clear to run a well-maintained, a well-oiled cooperative, it's difficult because you have to have a very competent setup when you get going. That's why it's little mom and pop shops usually that are co-ops. There's not usually a massive scale of co-ops. There are in some parts of the country, but like it's not that common because it's harder to get investment sometime as well, because you're not there just to please your shareholders. So it's like that's part of it, but it's not the same structure. If you're following the true co-op model, it's not the same structure. So there are all kinds of challenges that you have to face. But getting back to the food bank thing, I want to pivot back to the food bank where people should all have access to good, nutritious food, but how are you going to give them good, nutritious food if you're giving them the bare minimum food that you can get?
We have a supply chain crisis right now, and it's not a crisis that happened because of COVID. It's a crisis that happened because of capitalism. This is absolutely the way the system was designed, and the only way that we could ever reverse the decay that we're seeing right now is if government is willing to invest in the space and waste its resources to make a less efficient but more reliable system. Because right now, over the last few decades, we've been seeing 2 major transitions. First, we've been relying more and more on international trade, on international supply chains, on getting our resources, whether they be our agricultural products or our manufactured goods, from other countries. And we've also seen a huge increase in technology investment. And both of those are capital costs, have significantly increased the cost of doing business in literally every business around the world. And when you increase the cost of doing business, those mom and pop shops can no longer compete, and it's those big multinational corporations that end up swallowing them up. The truth of the matter is that we're just seeing consolidation in almost every single market space because the cost of doing business continues to rise. And as the cost continues to rise, there's less reason to compete.
But
It's
what do
safer,
poor
in
people
fact,
do
to
when they
integrate
want
your supply chain.
good, nutritious food? What do poor people do?
So the market is not going to be the solution to that, because there's almost no one to compete for their dollar. Right now, there's no incentive to compete. There's no incentive to open up a new market. If there's 2 or 3 companies that are the only ones that can supply grocery goods to Canadians, it's not worth it to them to expand their supply chain to feed those poor people. It's cheaper, in fact, just not to supply food to them and to focus on their higher class customers. And they can do that because they don't feel a need to expand. So if anyone's going to feed these people, it has to be government. It has to be someone that can afford the enormous costs of entering the market and not have to worry about making a profit. There's no other person that can do that. There's no other entity. You can say a co-op could do that, but the co-op would literally have to be the size of the country to do it, which, there is a co-op the size of the country. It's called the Government of Canada. And that's why I would suggest it has to be the federal or provincial governments have to enter that space.
No, but I think
just don't see anyone else that can do it.
What I guess that was one of the questions I had, but the other question that I've been trying to ask is, like, I think I'm still not. I think I still have a question from your first little blurb about government food banks when you were saying that, like, you're gonna get the bare minimum or whatever. It's like, I don't know. It's like what does bare minimum look like? Like, is it junk food?
Well,
like, can't we do better than that?
I think we can do better.
Can't the government do better than that?
No. So I think we can do better than. What I mean by the bare minimum is not that it's the worst. It's the worst food, but that there's no choice, or that there's effectively zero consumer choice. That you just get your no-name stuff, basically. Like that, you get your no-name products, and you get them at the absolute cheapest that can possibly be given to you, and you don't decide what brand, and probably get canned fruit instead of fresh fruit, like stuff like that. I think you can get access to everything that you need to eat. I truly don't see why you couldn't get access to everything you can eat. We waste more food in Canada. Like, we throw out more food than is required to feed all of our hungry people. So if you just redirect what is wasted, you've automatically won.
Rather than throwing in the trash.
Well, yeah, exactly. But that's what I mean by the bargain. But the way that you assure that something isn't wasted is by basically forcing someone to consume it because they have no choice.
Right.
So that's what I mean by bargain basement.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. And
thanks
the
for fleshing that out, because I was
that's
picturing
not,
like a bunch
yeah,
of people eating Joe Louis and fucking Rice Krispies in a basement, and I'm like, well, that's sad as shit. It has to be a little bit better than that.
No, but that's like that. Capitalism already offers that. Like, that's
right. That's what people are doing. But even sugar taxes now are driving people off of that. Like, it's. I'm not against certain government involvement to incentivize certain behaviors, but not like that. Like that's going to backfire.
No.
That's bad
the
policy.
worst possible thing. I don't think that the best case result is that government just this last resort food bank. I think that the best case result is that government nationalizes Loblaws. But I don't think that the social license exists for that. And I also, having worked in government, don't think that government has its capacity necessary to pull that off. Like, the only reason why I would suggest having a food bank is because when you're talking about people that are already on the edge of starvation, it's okay to fail because any improvement is better than what they currently have. And so it's fine for government to flop and fumble around. That's what's required. Government needs to be able to make some mistakes because we just have no expertise. Our government has been so hollowed out over the last few cycles of deficit reduction that there's no real policy experts that live in the government of Canada anymore. There's some that have very, very particular expertise, but we rely on a whole host of consultants and on outsourcing a lot of our work to other people. We pay a lot of money, we pay a lot of people, but not a lot of it is actually done by employees of the government of Canada. And that's because we've significantly reduced our highest costs, and our highest costs are people. So it's just cheaper to contract to other corporations that don't have to pay the enormous pensions and other benefits that the government of Canada workers get. And so because of that, we don't have their people power, we don't have their knowledge or expertise. If we're going to reverse this trend, if government is going to get into a space, it has to get into a space where it can fail. And if it takes over Loblaws, if it takes over the whole food supply and it fails, we go from a situation where a few people are starving to a situation where potentially everyone could be starving. I mean, that's like the horror of forced collectivization under the Soviet and Chinese regimes. But if we start smaller, if it's less ambitious, if we're only trying to feed people who are currently starving, and we fail at feeding people that are currently starving, they're no worse off than they were before. That's my suggestion. Because I know it sounds crass, I know it doesn't sound great, but the truth is that the Canadian government can't do a whole lot better right now. If we're going to offer a completely new service, we have to allow the possibility that it's going to be a fuck-up as big as Phoenix, basically. Because that's just like, literally any time that we do something new, it's going to be that case. Because we don't have anyone left that works for us that knows what the hell they're doing in new spaces. We know how to do our job right now. Any other stuff, I would not wager that we have the ability to pull it off.
What about some sort of Quango or public-private grocery chain, or I don't know, like some sort of combination of public-private, whether it be an arm's length corporation, Crown Corp, some sort of side type,
but
hybrid.
That's the other option, though. Is
that
it's,
possible?
Like what we could do is force Loblaws to become a co-op. Like you have to write legislation that basically makes that publicly buys back their shares for the rich Canadians. Every corporation exists either as an entity of the Canadian or provincial government. If people are starving, things can get changed really quickly. Legislation can get changed really quickly. And I hope that politicians feel the fire at their feet on this one.
I worry that they don't. I worry that the only one feeling I mean, I think the NDP are starting to get it. I don't know if it'll work for them just because of their leader, but their messaging has certainly tweaked. I just wonder how much
we'll see.
They're getting through
like
versus
someone
Poilievre.
like Liz.
I don't think the Liberals know what's going on.
Liz Truss in the UK could end up losing her job only a few months after having won it because of this situation. Because people in her country are freezing in their homes and cannot afford to feed themselves. So, once the first shoe drops here, once the first heads start to roll, I think we're going to have to start paying attention. Now, their inflation problem is much worse in the UK than it is in Canada, but we have nothing to brag about over here at all. We have nothing to brag about. Now, would making the Canadian government a shareholder of Loblaws effectively change the situation too much? No. But what we could use that for is a way for us to at least get a better cut of the profits and distribute those profits more equitably to the rest of the population. I mean, right now, the CEO doesn't have an incentive to maximize profit. They have an incentive to maximize shareholder value, to maximize share price. And so right now we tax the profits of corporations, which is a thing that as a CEO, you have an incentive to reduce as much as possible. You hide money in Bermuda or whatever to avoid paying income tax on corporate profits. But you have an incentive always to maximize the price of your shares. So if government is, instead of taxing income, has a share of the company, well, then that means you're actually taxing the thing that the executives are incentivized to grow. You could do the same thing with a wealth tax. You could do a corporate wealth tax. You could do a citizen wealth tax. It works in the same way. I'm just suggesting that right now, government is collecting from the wrong trough. There is a segment of the economy that's growing. It's just the segment that government is the least able to pick at. And multinational corporations have absolutely exploited this loophole.
Yep, and we give them tax breaks.
Yes, exactly.
So it's there's a lot of work to be done, and I think some politicians are waking up to the feet being nipped at, as they lay by the fire. It's not the fire nipping at their feet. The Canadians have burst in their front door and are nipping at their feet. And they can feel the money nipping at their wallets as it disappears out of their wallets,
Well,
they can feel the empty space tearing at their wallets.
This is the most dangerous situation because hungry people are very easy to politically organize for whatever cause you want. I mean, it's right now it's very expensive to organize people because people are generally happy, and so you have to constantly reach them, and you have to phone call them, you got to bombard them with emails, you have to invite them to your political cause in very expensive media ad buys. But if there's a huge segment of your population that's hungry, all you got to do is buy some water bottles, get some granola bars, and start passing them around and say, "Oh, by the way, you hate Jews now," or something like that. And they'll be like, "Okay, I guess I hate these people." I mean, that's like, it's if you want to know how countries get taken over by extremists, it's because it's the cost of exploiting people politically decreases to a certain point where really nasty groups can start forming their own alliances really quickly. Like, you really don't want to have a society that becomes destabilized like that. Absolutely do not want that. And that's why so many governments in the past, whether it be the Roman Empire, whether it be the Han Dynasty in China, there's so many examples, have subsidized food for their populations because they know that is a huge, huge political weakness.
And on that usually cheery note, is there anything else? I think we covered everything. We don't want to add anything else before we wrap up here.
Anything else? I don't know, Liam. I can't think.
I think you just kind of made the point.
I feel like we could do so many episodes about so many other things. I mean, Danielle Smith is like 3 episodes in and of herself every Tuesday. But
seriously, and we have yet to crack into that nut because that in itself, like you just said, is so much, and that's going to be an interesting one to watch, as will Liz Truss. Those are going to be interesting ones to watch, and we'll probably be talking about them in the coming weeks. But I'm glad that we focused on this today, and it frustrates me that there's no tangible solution in front of us, that we're just stuck here accepting this shitty status quo, and it's so rough, it's so terrible, and all you can do is kind of donate to your local food bank and help them out. Just so do that. I encourage everybody to do that if you haven't already. But on that usually happy note, if you have anything you want to say to us, you can email to speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. All one word. Thanks for listening today, and take good care of yourselves.
Bye.